Hello and welcome to Whatcast. My name is Roger Watson, and these podcasts are dedicated to readings of various articles that I've had published in newspapers and magazines. They reflect my views on politics, the pandemic, and current affairs. Thank you very much for listening. Exactly how effective are these vaccines? This is my Unity News Network column of the 28th of July, 2021. In a recent article in this column questioning if the COVID-19 vaccines work, it transpires I was being too generous about them. I'd not dug deeply enough into what the reported figures for effectiveness, the 90%, 89, 70%, etc. mean, and thanks to an alert and knowledgeable reader called Mark Newman, I've now dug a bit deeper. The vaccine story is a lot less impressive than I first indicated. Even using the government's own method of reporting vaccine effectiveness, recent reports in the Daily Skeptic, until recently called Lockdown Skeptic's newsletter, these indicate that the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines is questionable and that they are much less effective than commonly believed, particularly in older people. In fact, we may deliberately have been misled from the outset. When vaccine manufacturers report that they're effective, for example, at 90%, they'd like you to think that this reduces your risk of becoming infected by 90%. But that's not what it means. They're referring to what is called the relative risk ratio. This means that the effectiveness being referred to is a risk relative to others who've not received the vaccine. For example, if you take two groups with 100 people in each, and the risk of the unvaccinated group becoming infected is 90 out of 100, and in the vaccinated group the risk is 10 out of 100, then the relative risk ratio is 90 minus 10, which is 80, and divided again by 90 and multiplied by 100 to give a percentage, and that's equal to 89%. Keep that figure in mind. It's not a very useful figure to quote, as another example will show. So if you take another two groups with 100 people in each, and the risk of the unvaccinated group becoming infected is this time 9 out of 100, and in the vaccinated group the risk is 1 out of 100, then the relative risk ratio is 9 minus 1, which is 8, divided again by 9, and multiplied by 100 to give a percentage. And this percentage is also equal to 89%. In both examples, the apparent effectiveness is the same, but in the first example, the initial risk of becoming infected is 90%, and in the second example, the risk of becoming infected is only 10%. These figures are referred to as the absolute risk. Therefore, in the first example, the true benefit of taking the vaccine, the ability to prevent you from becoming infected, is 80%, which is 90 minus 10%. Whereas, in the second example, the true benefit of taking the vaccine is only 8%, that's 9 minus 1%, and this is called the absolute risk reduction. And for any individual trying to decide whether or not to take a vaccine, this is the figure that should be considered. In other words, the benefit of any vaccine is related to the initial risk of becoming infected if you don't take it. When the risk is very low, the benefits will also be low. The relative risk reduction has its defenders, as in a recent Reuters fact check, where, in defence of its use, the following was quoted: vaccine efficacy expressed as the relative risk ratio means the vaccine will reduce the risk of infection by that reported percentage, irrespective of the transmission setting. But this is disingenuous. As explained above, it's not sensitive to the actual risk of infection. What about the COVID vaccines? For the sake of illustration, the overall probability, not taking different age groups or risk groups into account, of becoming infected, and I base this on the number in the UK who've been infected and died to date, is currently 8%, and the risk of death is 0.19%. Therefore, the initial absolute risk of both is low. Moreover, it's eminently possible that the COVID-19 figures related to both to infections and death are overestimated. This is due to the phenomenon of false positive testing, confusion over the definitions of death with COVID-19 as distinct from death from COVID-19, and the procedures for death certification having been relaxed. So what is the absolute risk reduction of COVID-19 vaccines? You don't have to take my word for this. It was published in The Lancet in April this year, and I quote, 1.3% for the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, 1.2% for the Moderna National Institute of Health vaccine, 1.2% for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, 0.93% for the Gamaleya vaccine, and 0.84% for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Now remember, this is how much less likely you are to become infected if you take the vaccine than if you do not. This is not as impressive as the percentages for effectiveness usually quoted. Using these figures, it's also possible to calculate the numbers needed to vaccinate, which is the number of people who need to be vaccinated to prevent one person becoming infected. The respective figures from the Lancet article for the above vaccines are: to prevent one more case of COVID-19, it's 81 for the Moderna National Institute of Health vaccine, 78 for the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, 108 for the Gamaleya vaccine, 84 for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and 119 for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines. As with any measure of effectiveness of a vaccine, the numbers needed to vaccinate is not perfect. Like the absolute risk reduction, depends on the initial risk of becoming infected, and it's also sensitive to the amount of data gathered. Therefore, these figures will probably change and possibly improve over time. Now, I hesitate to advise anyone over whether they should have a COVID-19 vaccine. It's unreasonable for everyone visiting a vaccination centre to be able to access the kind of information outlined above, or even to understand it. But there's no excuse for the UK government and the National Health Service not clarifying the facts about the initial level of risk to an individual and the likely benefit of the vaccine, both of which are low, and allowing them to weigh that up against the very high likelihood of unpleasant side effects and, however small, the risk of death.
This podcast was produced in association with youpublicationslimited.com.